Hello, my name is Michael Seregow, and I'm a member of the piano faculty at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. In today's presentation, I am going to talk about tone production at the piano. Unlike most instrumentalists and singers, the pianist does not bring their own instrument with them, unless, of course, you're Vladimir Horowitz. We have to rather play on whatever instrument we find in the performance space. And it's interesting to note that two different pianists can play the same instrument and sound quite different. One may have a much better sounding tone by comparison. Certain qualities are inherent in whatever instrument we are playing, but the individual brings a lot to the equation as well. So it bears keeping these things in mind as we consider what goes into tone production at the instrument, and this can help us to discover how to teach it. Harold Bauer, who was a well-regarded concert pianist from the first half of the 20th century, said the following about beautiful tone. He said, "I do not believe in a single beautiful tone on the piano. Tone at the piano can only be beautiful in the right place, that is, in relation to other tones. You or I or the man in the street who knows nothing about music may each touch a piano key, and that key will sound the same, whoever moves it from the nature of the instrument. A beautiful tone may result when two or more notes are played successively through their difference of intensity, which gives variety. A straight, even tone is monotonous, a dead tone. Variety is life. We see this fact exemplified even in the speaking voice. If one speaks or reads in an even tone, it is deadly monotonous." End quote. In ancient times, alchemists looked for methods by which they could turn base metals such as lead into gold. Alchemy can be more generally defined as any seemingly magical process of transforming or combining elements into something new. As pianists, we're always dealing with the various musical elements that are presented in a given piece, and our responsibility is to combine them together so they sound just right. The key to beautiful tone, then, is how each sound relates to those that are around it, or how each sound relates to the musical whole. Toward this, we must be aware of the horizontal, the vertical, as well as how the pedal influences our tone. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss first the horizontal aspect of music, or that what we refer to as phrasing. Next, I will talk about the vertical dimension of piano, the way we deal with musical texture or balance, and finally, I'll say a few words about the magic of the pedal. Before we proceed, though, it's worth keeping in mind that at the heart of good tone is a mindset of active, intentional listening. We must first work to develop a mental image of what the music should sound like, and also we need to have the technique to be able to produce that image at whatever piano we happen to be playing. And without this mindset of listening, it's impossible to develop a truly beautiful tone. Let's take a look first at the horizontal element of music, or phrasing. What does it mean to phrase well? And more importantly, how can we teach our students to phrase more artistically? We might naturally think of playing with a singing tone when we think about phrasing, especially in a lyrical piece, such as the one I just played. But I think it's also helpful to think about the similarities between speech and musical phrasing. The famous teacher from the 19th century, Theodor Leczetitsky, actually said, "The actor is the musician's closest cousin." In speech, each word has strong and weak syllables, and sentences have important and unimportant words. different emphasis within a sentence can bring about a slightly different meaning. To phrase musically, then, we need to be aware of both the local detail, how one note relates to the very next one or the one before it, but we also need to be aware of the larger scale organization of the musical phrases. For example, how does this phrase move? What is the trajectory? What's the direction of a phrase? What are the most important notes within the phrase? When I'm teaching phrasing and working with phrasing with my students, I like to use the terms micro-shaping and macro-shaping. Micro-shaping, then, is the localized detail. How does one note relate directly to the note directly in front or before it? To phrase artistically, we must learn to listen to this note-to-note connection within the context of a phrase if we want to create a really fluid or musical line. As a basic example of this, we can think of the two-note slur. This is a little bit like a two-syllable word in speech, such as the word music. We have a strong syllable and a weak syllable. With the two-note slur, we typically will play the first note with a stronger sound, and then we'll come away from the second note a little bit. This can actually be a good exercise for students to practice and can help them to listen more attentively to what the sound does between two notes. Of course, once we strike a key on the piano, the sound immediately begins to decay. And we can hear that the sound is gradually going away. How quickly that happens really depends on the instrument itself. But when we play a two-note slur, we want to try to match that sound when we move to the second note. So we can start at a slower tempo and really listen carefully for that decay of sound from the first tone. We'll often accompany this with a physical gesture, such as dropping the arm and then lifting the wrist on the second note, and that can help us also to achieve this effect. Of course, when we speed up, the amount of motion we make will become less. But practicing, again, two-note slurs like this as an exercise can really help to the student to listen more carefully again to how one note relates to the note that directly follows it. We'll often want to end phrases with this sort of tapered shape, and we'll find lots of other places within a phrase where we'll want to be listening carefully to this note-to-note connection. Macro shaping, with this term, I refer to the larger scale structures in place. What actually constitutes a phrase? How is the musical material organized into larger sections? I recommend that you spend time with your students in their lessons teaching them to analyze phrase structure, and you can even mark this into the score so that the student begins to develop an understanding of how their music is actually put together. There are two common phrase structures that I'd like to talk briefly about today. The first one is called sentence structure. In sentence structure, the phrase begins with a short segment, which is typically then repeated, followed by a longer segment, often twice as long. So we can think of this phrase as short, short, long. We find this pattern in a great deal of music, actually, and some of the examples I'll look at in just a moment, we'll see sentence structure being used. Another common phrase structure that we find in a lot of music is something that's called antecedent consequent phrase structure. A simple way of saying this one is question and answer. And so we should realize that phrases often combine together to create even larger musical units. We often call these musical periods. So antecedent consequent or question and answer is an example of this. In this type of phrase structure, two phrases will often begin in a similar way, and then the second one will end in a little bit different way. So the first phrase sort of asks a question, if you will, and then the second phrase answers that question. Often this is done through the use of a more conclusive sounding musical cadence. Once the student understands what constitutes a phrase and they've have this awareness of phrase structure, they can then identify what notes within the phrase are the most important ones and make better decisions about how to shape their phrases. Of course, the meter of a piece provides a framework, but not every downbeat is going to be of equal importance. I'm sure we've all heard students who just want to emphasize the downbeat, and this can sound rather pedantic. So this is something that we typically probably want to avoid. Musical emphasis often falls on high notes, long notes, syncopated notes, and also dissonant notes. So we want to see how the notes relate to the harmony sometimes, and these dissonant notes can bring a sense of tension and release to our playing. I'd like to say just a few words about how we emphasize notes, since we're talking about this. Two ways we can think about this is through using greater volume or an accent. But another way that we can emphasize notes is actually through our timing. We do this all the time in speech. If you think of speaking an important word, sometimes we place that word, we take a little bit more time with the word. We can also do this when we phrase, and it's especially appropriate in more lyrical music when we might not want to use too much volume on a note so that, that it doesn't stick out of the musical texture too much. Let's take a look at some musical examples and see how these two elements of, or these two aspects of phrasing work in tandem, both macro shaping and micro shaping. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Here is the piece that I played several minutes ago at the beginning of our discussion of phrasing. This is from Schumann's album for the young. This is number 30 from that collection, a piece to which Schumann gave no title, but it's a lovely study of phrasing and a great piece for working on tone production at the piano. I've already marked a few things on the score here. I'd like to start by discussing macro shaping, or how the phrases are organized. This is a nice example of the sentence structure that I mentioned just a few moments ago, where we have a one-bar bit, a short bit, followed by a repetition of that same material, another one-bar bit, followed by a longer phrase segment that concludes the first phrase. So we can see that marked on the score here. We also have antecedent consequent phrase structure if we look at the first two of the four-bar phrases here. The opening two phrases are quite similar. The only difference is as we approach the final cadence of each phrase. The second phrase has a more conclusive sounding musical cadence. So now that we've talked a little bit about what actually constitutes a phrase, I want to look at several considerations that can help us to play these phrases more expressively. Within the first one-bar bit, the A on the downbeat is our most expressive note. It's the long note of this little phrase segment. It's also a dissonant with the bass. I would recommend a slight crescendo into that chord, and then this is a good example of what I talked about earlier with that practice with two-note slurs, of listening to the note decay. So as we move from the A to the G, we want to be very aware of that sound and trying to have a tapered sound there. We'll have a similar shape in the second one-bar bit, although since it's a repetition, I would encourage you to try something slightly different. Maybe the timing is a little different, maybe it's more intense, or maybe you treat it as an echo. Actually, this idea is repeated a lot through this piece, so you can play around with a lot of ideas in that regard. These two one-bar bits are then followed by a two-measure bit, and I would create a little bit more of a sense of forward momentum. I'm going to draw a forward arrow here. We want to move toward the cadence at the end of the phrase. Again, a slight sense of forward motion can help to hear that this is a longer phrase segment. And moving toward the 4/3 suspension that concludes the phrase. This note here is going to be dissonant with the bass, so we can play it expressively and then listen to a tapered phrase ending. Let's go ahead and listen to this four-bar phrase again with these expressive details in place. All right, let's next look at an example from a Clementi sonatina. This is the second one in the Opus 36 collection, quite a famous teaching piece, but there's a lot that we can talk about here in terms of how to phrase. So I've already marked in, again, the phrase structure for the first two phrases. Here we have an example of antecedent consequent phrase structure. These two opening four-bar phrases form what we refer to as a parallel period. The second one also, we can note, already modulates to a new key, as we would expect with the sonatina form. You'll notice that phrase ends in the key actually of D major, and we stay then in D major for the rest of the exposition in this sonatina. So now that we have established that we have these two four-bar phrases, we want to figure out where the important notes are in the phrase and consider several things in terms of microshaping, or the note-to-note connection. The fortsando, the high note in the second full measure, that gives us a clue, of course, that this is probably the strongest note in our four-bar phrase. But I also want to talk about some of the expressive detail that we can bring to the first measure. We've got two-note slurs here. So as I talked about before, we can think strong, weak with both of these. But at the same time, we want these two-note slurs to feel like they are leading us toward the second measure, that they're taking us to that high note of the phrase. After we play the long note, we want to listen. Clementi's written a piano there. We want to listen to the diminuendo of the long note and try to match that. And I would recommend that we are careful not to emphasize the downbeat in the third measure. So we want this to be a very light sound. Sometimes we'll find that notes kind of grouped together in certain ways. The 16th notes at the end of this phrase can feel like they are taking us toward the fourth bar, and then we can end with a tapered shape there at the end. I would recommend that students who are working on this can actually choreograph some of these motions. So again, as I talked about earlier with the two-note slurs, we can use a down-up motion, but we can try to think about how to move the arm to make sure that all of these expressive details happen. Naturally, as we play faster, we'll want to have a lot less motion, but I find that this can be a useful thing to practice, and it can help students understand that physical gesture can have a profound impact on the sound at the keyboard. I'm going to go ahead and speed this up a little bit so we can hear the phrasing in context. All right, let's look at one more example. This is by Cornelius Gurlitt from a collection called Buds and Blossoms, which is Opus 107. This is, if you're not familiar with this set of pieces, it's really quite a wonderful set of intermediate level Romantic era character pieces. None of them have titles. This is number 4 within that collection. So again, we have an example of a parallel period, or the question and answer. And there are two things I want to point out that are different between these two phrases. First, look at the bass line. In the first phrase, we have a pedal tone. The bass remains on that A throughout the 4-bar measure. In the second measure, however, the bass finally moves and helps create a stronger musical cadence at the end of the second 4-bar phrase. The other difference is the interval going into the second measure of each respective phrase. In the first phrase, we have an interval of a third. So as Gurlitt writes on there, we want to play that expressively, a slight crescendo toward the C sharp, and then we can listen again to the sound of that important note as we taper a little bit away from it. However, in the second phrase, we now have the interval of a fifth, so we can be more expressive this second time. And again, I talked about sometimes that we use agogic accents. You might consider taking a little bit of extra time or sort of stretching or reaching for that higher interval, just so we can hear the difference between the fact that we're going up a third the first time and then a fifth the next time. Let's take a listen to these two phrases together. Let us now turn our attention to the vertical dimension of the pianist's art, how we deal with musical texture or balance. Most of the time, the pianist will play more than one note at a time. In fact, musical texture at the piano can be quite complicated, often involving some combination of melody, bass, and accompaniment. It is therefore important that we consider how these sounds relate to each other as we create a sort of hierarchy of sound. Obviously, not every sound is going to be set at the same level within a given musical texture. The pianist, teacher, and writer Harriet Brower offers a lovely analogy from the world of visual arts concerning musical texture. She says the following: "It is like looking at a picture. You see the various objects represented. Some are in the foreground and catch the eye first. Others are in middle distance, not perceived so readily, while others again are set far back in the distance and are quite misty and shadowy. It would be quite unnatural if the faraway distance were painted very distinctly and the foreground shadowy. Objects must be set in correct relation to each other, or the whole effect is destroyed." End quote. I think we can see that there's a lot of similarities here then with what we want to accomplish with musical texture at the piano. Perhaps the most obvious challenge in dealing with the vertical aspect of piano music is first developing a technique that's actually capable of creating all the different intensities of sound at the same time. So I would like to talk about a few things regarding teaching tone control at the piano. I think from the earliest stages, we want to make sure that our students are always aware of the sound that they produce at the piano. Even simple exercises should be done with sound quality in mind. As elementary students maybe begin with something like pentascales, we want to make sure that they incorporate dynamics and, for that matter, articulation as well into their practice. When you hear your students play pentascales for you, for example, ask them to produce various dynamic levels. You can start with 3 levels and make sure that they're each distinct. For example, soft, medium, and loud. And of course, we can teach them the appropriate terminology that goes with that. Once they can do that well, then try tackling 5 levels of sound. Once they're able to do that, how about 8? Students need to be able to produce these various shades at will if they want to then be able to play repertoire with the appropriate levels of dynamics. The next step is to work on creating balance between the individual hands at the same time. Again, this can be done with things like pentascales, or with, for more advanced students, their scales, or even exercises, hands together exercises like Hanon, and so on and so forth. Ask your students to play such things, but with each hand playing at a different dynamic level. For example, the right hand could be forte while the left hand is piano. Of course, they should be able to do the opposite as well, so the left hand would be forte and the right hand piano. Many students will struggle with this at first, but I found that actually the following trick works very well. I have yet to find a student who isn't able to produce this effect after trying the following experiment. Ask your student to play just the right hand by itself with a forte dynamic level. Next, ask them to play the left hand, but to do so by only tapping the surface of the keys with no sound. Once they've done each of these things hands separately, ask them then to do both at the same time. So they're going to play the right hand forte. They're going to pretend to play the left hand by tapping the surface of the keys. It'll look like this. Again, the student might struggle with that a little bit at first. It's a coordination issue, but most students that I've showed this to have pretty quickly figured out how to do it. Once they're able to do that a few times and feel comfortable doing so, then go back and ask them to play the left hand with that piano dynamic. And by that point, they should be able to do that. Again, this can be extended into, for your more advanced students, they can practice their scales this way. And as I suggested earlier, it's great for articulation practice as well, to do things like having your students play one hand legato, one hand staccato. These are all basic coordinations that a student must master in order, again, to use them in actual repertoire. So I find that this is a good way to prepare students to have a more varied palette of colors and sounds at their disposal. The more advanced student will then also need to work on playing different sound levels with the same hand at the same time. This is definitely trickier than what we've talked about so far. But one way to start to work on this is just to use chords and inversions and to stagger the notes. In most repertoire, we're asked to bring out the top note of the chord. Of course, that's with our fifth finger. And so we have to really work to get this finger used to bringing out a note while the other notes of the chord remain quiet. So again, like I said, we can stagger these two things. And just playing triads and inversions can be a good way to practice this. Once students are comfortable doing that, we can move those two things closer together. Finally, they can start to work on playing that as a blocked chord. One other thing I'll discuss that can help with our tone control. This is most evident on a grand piano. If you push the key down part way, you feel a point where there's resistance. This is known as the escapement level on the key. Once you move beyond that, you feel like a slight click in the action. If you aim just to that halfway point, this is a good way to play, to control the volume when you want to play your sound softer. So again, going back to this same exercise, you want to play to the bottom of the key. With the other two notes, you can just play to the escapement level, not necessarily to the bottom of the key. As students start to play again with blocked chords, this can help in controlling the sound. As students advance with this, they can also work with four-note chords or with seventh chords or diminished chords. Ideally, for the advanced student, we should be able to bring out any note of a chord at will, not just the fifth finger. For those with a large enough hand, the fully diminished seventh chord can be a way to practice this. So any note of those from that chord can be brought out at will. Of course, this does take quite a lot of practice, but this does pay off in the long run in terms of developing the ability to really produce any sound that you want to at the keyboard. Having said that, let's take a look at our musical examples, some of which we already looked at earlier with phrasing, but this time I want to return to them and talk about how we can approach tone production with each of these in terms of the musical texture or of balance. So I'm going to go back and share my screen again. All right, here is our G major Clementi sonatina once again. This one's pretty straightforward, right? We have a melody in the right hand and we have an accompaniment in the left hand. So when we have a simpler musical texture like this with melody and accompaniment, we can think about how that works maybe in terms as being a ratio, right? Where 50-50 would mean that both voices were absolutely equal. Here we could think of maybe a 60-40 ratio. We want to bring out whatever the dynamic level is, we want to bring out the right hand slightly more than the left hand. If that doesn't get the desired effect, then you could even ask for a 70-30 ratio. The important thing here is to remember that if the melody is going to increase in sound, we want to make sure that we support with the left hand as well. But again, we want to keep these this level of balance, these levels in check, so that the left hand doesn't overtake the melody in the right hand. Let's take a quick listen to that. All right, I want to next move on to the gurlet that we looked at just a little bit ago. And I think this piece in particular is a great study for musical texture and in terms of developing the ability to bring out the melody with the top notes, the top fingers on the hand, the fifth, the fourth fingers on the right hand in particular. Like the exercise I suggested a few moments ago, the fact that the melody and the accompaniment are staggered gives the student kind of an opportunity to develop this skill. So in playing this, we want to make sure that all the melodic notes with the up stems on them are played with a full singing tone, but we want to make sure that these two-note chords that intervene on the second 16th of each beat are played with much less sound. So in working on something like this, it can be beneficial just to practice that right hand under tempo and then to exaggerate the difference between those two elements of sound. We'll want to play to the bottom of the key for the melody with a strong sound, and again, not necessarily play to the bottom of the key for the accompaniment on the second 16th note. One other thing I would suggest is to make sure that the melodic notes are actually sustained or held on the keyboard. The accompanying notes can be released. Ultimately, this will be pedaled later on as a student polishes things up. But by working to create a good legato with the fingers, that can help with the singing effect in the right hand. For some more advanced students, you might even talk about things like finger substitution to create legato. So on the last note of the first measure, we would play with finger 5, and then we could substitute to 4 to, again, really create a legato feel as we move up to the high note in the second measure there. Then we can really, again, work to create a good legato, and that frees us up to use the pedal. We don't have to rely as heavily on the pedal to create our legato. One other consideration in this piece is to make sure now that the accompanying texture, the 16th notes that are passed between the hands, are played as smoothly as possible. So this can be also practiced separately by leaving the melody out entirely. That might sound like this, and we want to again make sure that as we pass from right to left hand, these 16th notes are very smooth. All of this can then be practiced together. Again, slow practice can be very helpful for this, and when we practice slowly, I find it's useful to exaggerate these levels a little bit. So again, to really bring out the melody at a slow tempo and to really keep the accompaniment in the background. As we speed up, these things kind of naturally come together a little bit more closely. That might sound like this. All right, let's next take a look at the Schumann example that we saw a bit ago. This one's a little bit trickier from the standpoint of a balance, because here we have blocked chords and we need to be able to bring out the top note within those textures. As we talked about earlier when I discussed phrasing, this A here is that important note in the first little bit of the phrase, and then later on we have several notes happening at the same time. In these chords here near the end of the phrase, we want to make sure that we bring those out a little bit more than everything else in the musical texture. One other thing that we can talk about here is actually the counter melody that we find in the left hand in the tenor part. This is important too, and we want to play that expressively, but now we need to also listen to the primary melody and balance the counter melody so that it doesn't get in the way of that sound. Go ahead and take a listen just to that opening one-bar phrase again, and listen to how the counter melody is set in relationship to the primary melody in the right hand. If that tenor voice is played too strongly, it takes away from the sustain and the phrasing that we are trying to work on in our right hand part. So again, we have to make sure to set it at the correct level. It's important, it's interesting, but it can't get too much in the way of our primary melody. Let's look at one more musical example to talk about musical texture. This is Spanish Dance No. 5 by Enrique Granados. And here we see kind of a three-part musical texture comprised of melody, bass, and accompaniment. Again, this would be probably a little more advanced piece than some of the others that I looked at, but it's a lot of fun to play, and again can illustrate some of the things I've been talking about regarding musical texture. When we have this kind of three-part texture, I find it helpful to study just sometimes just voices, each part by itself, or just pairs two at a time. For example, we could study the melody and the accompaniment figure. The melody there starts at the end of the first line. So again, just similar to what we saw in the gurlet, we want to make sure that these offbeat chords are not played too loudly, right? They're the accompaniment, so we want to set them a little bit into the background. So again, slow practice and a little bit of exaggeration can help us with this. We could also practice playing the bass line along with that accompaniment figure. Again, the accompaniment figure would be less than the bass notes. And then finally, again, like we did earlier, we can put all three things together and study slowly kind of the relationship between those three aspects of the musical texture. And then with a little practice, we can then start to speed things up, add a little bit of pedal, and then things start to sound as they should. before wrapping up, I'd like to say a few words about the pedal. While I could give a whole presentation on the pedal, for the sake of time, I'll have to limit myself to just a few comments. Let's start by considering the function of the pedal. Perhaps the most obvious function is that it allows us to sustain sounds with our foot after we release the notes with our fingers. This can help us create fuller sounds that wouldn't be possible with the 10 fingers alone. Without the pedal, sonorities such as this one from Chopin's First Ballade would be impossible. We can hear the fullness of the pedal and the resonance of the instrument, and how Chopin utilizes the pedal to such great effect. Beyond sustaining notes with our foot, however, another function of the pedal is that it actually alters the sound somewhat. A chord played with the pedal sounds different than a chord played without the pedal. If we listen to the first chord of that Schumann example from earlier, without pedal versus with. The second one, hopefully we can hear on over Zoom, definitely has more of a fullness, a resonance to it. The reason for this is that the strings in the piano don't just produce their own fundamental pitch, but they also vibrate sympathetically with other notes that are a part of their overtone series. I can illustrate this by holding a note down silently on the keyboard, and if I play the notes that are in its overtone series, we'll hear those lingering afterwards. So that's going to be the octave fifth, another octave third. So again, what you hear is the resonance from this one string that vibrates as it vibrates sympathetically with the other pitches that I play. You can also try holding down keys silently on your keyboard and playing a chord, and you get a similar kind of effect. Again, the bass strings are vibrating sympathetically with the chord that I played, and so we get that after effect. So when we press the pedal down, the dampers all lift off the strings, and then all of the strings within the piano are then free to vibrate with whatever notes that we are actually playing, and this is what enhances the tone and creates that pedaled sound. So just a few words about teaching the pedal. There's a lot that I could say here, but the first thing I would mention is that we want to just make sure that when we utilize the pedal that we're making quiet and efficient motions with the foot. I've heard even professional pianists on occasion guilty of stomping at the pedal, and this can create quite a distraction actually to what they're trying to do at the instrument. So the pedal can remain close to, the foot can remain close to the pedal, and again to try to work on efficient and quiet motions. The first consideration as we're working with students is to master the timing of the foot. Occasionally we might find passages where the foot and the hands move at the same time, but more often than not we use something called syncopated pedal. That means that the foot actually lifts up at the moment when we press the keys, and then we push the pedal down slightly after that. Again, for students for whom this is new, this can be a little tricky to master. For any students who do have a little bit of trouble with that, the following little simple exercise can help in terms of learning that timing. I'm going to share my screen here. So you can see on your screen just a simple exercise I've written out. We're going to play triads just on the white keys, and of course if we do this, there's a gap in between the sounds. So we're going to use the pedal to connect these sounds together, and I find that it's helpful to actually assign a rhythmic point at which to move the pedal. So on beat 1, the foot goes up, and then on beat 2, the foot goes down. This helps the student to really be aware of the timing of their foot, rather than just saying up, down. The foot has to be lifted precisely on beat 1 and put down precisely on beat 2. So that's going to sound like this. Up, down, 3, 4. Up, down, 3, 4. Up, down, 3, 4. and so forth. This can be continued through the span of an octave or whatever. Once the student can do this, the down motion could be moved closer to beat 1. So you might think of an eighth note, up, down, 2, 3, 4. Up, down, 2, 3, 4. Up, down, 2, 3, 4. Once the pedal's pressed down, of course, the hand can release the chord and the pedal will sustain it. If the student does this correctly, the sound should be seamless, right? One chord should smoothly connect to the next one. If the sounds blur together, then the student has has changed the pedal too late. But if there's a hiccup or a gap between the sounds, then the student has anticipated the lifting motion of the foot by a little bit, and so they can again work on perfecting that timing. I would recommend that this exercise also be done with the left hand playing the chords so that the student gets used to pedaling both for the right hand and the left hand. Once the student has a firm grasp of the timing of the foot, then the next thing to begin to explore is something that I think can open up a world of coloristic possibilities at the instrument. That is the depth of pedal. How deep do you push the pedal down? The pedal is not just an on and off switch, but in fact, we can think of it more like a dimmer switch that you might have in your dining room, right? So you can dial in just the right amount of light with a dimmer switch to set like a mood for a special dinner or something like that, right? Rather than having the light be fully on or off. So you can do this at your own instrument. Start pushing the pedal down and play a repeated chord of some sort, right? At the top, there's no pedal effect. But as your foot continues to press, you'll feel a point in the descent where you can feel a little bit of resistance where your foot encounters the damper mechanisms. At this point, you start to get just a little bit of pedal effect. There's like a little bit of ring, but not the full thing. Take note of that spot right there. You can create all sorts of coloristic possibilities. As the foot continues to move further down, then we get to the point where we have the full effect of the pedal. So this takes some practice, and each piano is going to be a little bit different in this regard. This is most noticeable and most effective on a grand piano on an upright, where you're not going to necessarily get as responsive of a pedal mechanism. This is the next thing, though, that can really help a student improve their sound, that can open up, again, like I said before, a world of coloristic possibilities. Composers rarely tell us how to pedal their works, and even when they do, sometimes the indications that are provided, if they're followed too literally especially, don't always work out so well. So in most cases, we have to rely on our knowledge of the musical style and then just being able to start to experiment with these factors. How long do we hold the pedal and when do we change it? Or how deep do we press the pedal down? This is going to change from piece to piece, from style to style, and so forth. So, and furthermore, we can think about depending on what the musical texture is and how we handle that, how we balance things, that can have an impact on our pedaling as well. It really is quite a complicated matter, and so maybe it's best that composers don't try to tell us how to pedal, because I don't know that any sort of notational system can fully communicate what to do with the pedal. That's just something that kind of has to be discovered through experience and through practicing. Perhaps we can begin to understand what Chopin was after when he said that the proper use of the pedal is a study of a lifetime. Ultimately, we have to pedal with our ear. Our ear has to listen. We have to be in this mindset of active listening that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, and to determine if we're using the pedal correctly or not. And that way, I guess it's a little bit like salt is to cooking. If you've had undersalted food, you know how bland that it can sometimes taste. But at the same time, oversalted food can be just as unpalatable. The piano, the pedal without the piano without any pedal can sometimes sound very dry. But again, over-pedaled musical textures can also be just as problematic. So the secret is just figuring out how to use just the right amount. Let's return to some of the examples that we looked at earlier, but this time take a look at them from the perspective of pedal use and see what we can discover about how to use the pedal. I'm going to pull up the, we'll start with the Schumann, and I'll again put that on the screen here. All right. So with this one, the first thing I would say is, as a general guide, we want to change the pedal when the harmony changes, right? And so the chord, the upbeat chord, and the chord that follows are different. And so we'll want to change the pedal. And then in the third bar, we have one chord per beat, and so we'll of course want to change the pedal with each of those chords so that they don't blur together. But one other thing that we have to consider is counter melodies. And so I already talked about that counter melody in the tenor. If I hold the pedal through that, it ends up sounding really blurry. We get something that's kind of cacophonous and does not fit in very well with this piece. Right, so we don't want those notes to blur together in the pedal. So we need to actually have quick changes with each of those moving pitches. We'd probably leave the pedal down for that F since it's already part of the chord, but definitely by the time we move to the E and the G, we want to change the pedal for each of those to clear out, to keep the texture clear. Change, change, change. Change, change, change. So that's something, again, as students get more advanced, they need to learn how to do, and that's part of that is just, again, working on that pedal technique so that we have the facility with our foot to be able to keep textures clear. We'll want to use the same kind of pedaling at the end of that first 4-bar phrase to clear these notes out as well so that they don't blur. Let's go next and look at the granados and see a little bit about how our pedal can work here as well. All right, so here we go. So in the introduction, we have these grace notes. They're the half steps, right? This sounds pretty terrible, I think, if we hold the pedal down through. So I would recommend that you don't do that. You could push the pedal down for the E, but then you should release, and then I would say, suggest no pedal through the rest of that measure. Once the melody comes in, then we can consider what we talked about earlier about the change of pedal that goes with harmonies. And so we may hold the pedal here for that whole harmony. But in the second half of this measure, we have this stepwise motion in the melody. And I find, for me anyways, that if I hold the pedal through that, it's a little blurry. So we sometimes want to actually pedal for the melody as well. So I would recommend changing in both of those places to preserve a little bit more clarity for the melody. So let's take a listen to that. Change. And then, of course, we have different harmonies, so we need to change, change. And then, again, no pedal for the grace notes. So these are things that we can write into our students' scores if necessary. And have a discussion about how to use the pedal and so on. A little further down on this page, it's possible here to hold the pedal for that entire measure and then change in the next. But part of that will depend on how deep we push the pedal and how the balance is between the other parts of the musical texture. So some might want to change the pedal more frequently, or you might consider using just a more shallow application of pedal so it doesn't sound over-pedaled. Again, the ear has to be the final judge of such things. I next want to go back and look again at our the gurlet example. And in this piece, we actually have 3 pages of pretty much the same musical texture. So I think this is kind of a fascinating opportunity to explore how to use the pedal, how deep we push the pedal down versus a shallow application of pedal, also duration of pedal. As an example, I'll just play the first phrase. If I change the pedal once per beat, I get a fuller, a more resonant sound. If I use shorter and maybe shallower applications of pedal, I can actually get more of a pizzicato sort of effect for the bass notes, which I kind of like at the beginning. So again, I'm not pushing the pedal as deep, and then I'm releasing a little sooner, and so the pedal motion might look something more like this. And so that can give me a different sounding musical texture. So I would recommend experimenting with that. You know, in a piece like this, we can really experiment with that application of pedal. You know, if we want a fuller, richer sounding musical texture, that longer, deeper applications of pedal can help us to do that, especially if the dynamics grow or become fuller. On the other hand, if we want to keep things a little lighter feeling, we can rely on shorter and shallower applications of pedal. To conclude with, I'll go ahead and play through this entire piece by Gurlitt. It's fairly short. But as I play it, just listen to how these different aspects I've talked about in this presentation come together to sort of form, again, what we perceive as tone quality at the piano. Particularly, pay attention to some of how the pedal use affects the dynamics and the phrasing and can give some variety to this musical texture that kind of just stays the same throughout.